December 17th, 1972, 8:30 in the morning, Palm Hall, Chino Reception Center, California. Rodolfo Cheyenne. Cadena stepped out of his cell onto the third tier, knowing exactly what was waiting for him. For days he had been warned. The norteños had been taunting him. Threats had been circulating through the yard. He could have stayed inside. He could have refused to come out. Instead, he chose to walk into the open. Within minutes, he was surrounded by attackers armed with sharpened metal shanks and makeshift weapons. They stabbed him repeatedly, an estimated 50 times on the concrete walkway. Then they lifted his body and threw it over the railing, sending him 3 stories down to the floor below. When he landed, the violence continued, more than a dozen additional stab wounds ending his life in a pool of blood. He was 29 years old. His death was not just another prison killing. It was the end of one of the most important early architects of what would become the Mexican Mafia. Rodolfo Cadena's life began in 1943 in San Antonio, Texas, where he was born to Mexican-American parents who later moved the family to Bakersfield, California. He grew up in the Central Valley, surrounded by poverty, oil fields, and the rigid social divisions of working-class life. By his teenage years, he had already entered the world of street gangs. At just 16 years old, he committed his first murder outside a dance hall, a moment that would define his trajectory into the prison system. Sent to the Duell Vocational Institution, Cadena entered a place that was quietly becoming something far more dangerous than a juvenile facility. It was becoming the birthplace of a new criminal order. Inside Duell, in the late 1950s, the foundations of La M, the Mexican Mafia, were being formed by young Chicano inmates seeking protection in a violent prison environment. What began as a survival mechanism against other racial groups quickly evolved into an organized structure built on loyalty, discipline, and absolute enforcement. By the time Cadena arrived in 1959, the group was still forming its identity. He did not create La M, but he became one of its earliest and most influential figures. Within months, he had already proven himself through violence inside the institution, gaining respect from the founding members and establishing his reputation as both disciplined and fearless. At Duell, Cadena met Joseph Joe Morgan, a Croatian-American inmate whose background made him an outsider in every sense. Morgan grew up in Los Angeles neighborhoods dominated by Mexican-American gangs, where he gradually integrated into their world. By adolescence, he spoke Spanish fluently and moved comfortably within Chicano street culture. His early life was defined by escalating violence and repeated incarceration, including a 1946 murder conviction and a later bank robbery after his release from prison. Over time, Morgan developed a reputation not just for violence, but for intelligence and organization. One of the most infamous episodes associated with Morgan involved a prison escape in 1961, when he and other inmates broke out of custody using hacksaw blades concealed inside his prosthetic leg. The escape became legend within California's prison system, reinforcing his reputation as both resourceful and dangerous. Eventually, Morgan would become the first non-Mexican deeply embedded within La M's leadership structure, forming a strategic partnership with Cadena that would define the gang's early expansion inside the prison system. By the early 1960s, Cadena and Morgan had become central figures within the growing prison network. Transferred to San Quentin during a period of escalating institutional violence, Cadena immediately established dominance through brutality. In one widely recounted incident, he killed a large inmate on the yard in front of more than 1,000 prisoners, an act that solidified his reputation permanently. From that moment forward, he was recognized as untouchable within the prison hierarchy. Together, Cadena and Morgan expanded La M's influence across California's correctional institutions. They enforced order within Mexican-American inmate populations while also engaging in violence, extortion, gambling operations, and narcotics distribution behind bars. Morgan's outside connections, including early drug trafficking links, would later help extend La M's reach beyond prison walls and into Southern California neighborhoods. Their partnership represented a shift in the organization from a loose prison clique into a structured criminal network. Despite their criminal consolidation, Cadena's ideology evolved in a different direction over time. By the early 1970s, he began to view La M not just as a gang, but as a potential political force within Chicano society, influenced by radical political movements of the era, including the Brown Berets and broader civil rights activism. He began reading political theory and advocating for unity among rival factions. His vision extended beyond violence into organization and control at a larger scale. One of Cadena's most controversial decisions was his attempt to negotiate peace between La M and its longtime rival, the Nuestra Familia. The conflict between the two organizations had originated from internal prison disputes and quickly escalated into a long-standing regional war between Northern and Southern California inmates and street gangs. Cadena believed this conflict weakened Chicano power as a whole and sought to unify the factions under a broader alliance. He arranged meetings with representatives of Nuestra Familia, including high-level inmates scheduled for discussions at Chino. However, internal resistance within La M undermined these efforts. Leadership figures, including Joe Morgan and others, did not support peace negotiations. Instead, prior to any formal agreement, rival faction members were targeted and killed, effectively sabotaging the peace process. With negotiations collapsing, Cadena lost his diplomatic position and became vulnerable. Within the internal logic of the organization, he was no longer useful as a negotiator. He had become a liability. At Chino Reception Center, tensions escalated rapidly. Norteño inmates openly taunted Cadena, signaling that his protection had eroded. On December 17, 1972, he made the decision to step onto the tier despite knowing the risk. His death was brutal, public, and symbolic. Within prison culture, it represented not just a killing, but a political shift. His assassination triggered immediate retaliation and escalated the existing war between La M and Nuestra Familia, a conflict that would continue for decades and claim thousands of lives. Cadena was buried in Bakersfield with an inscription dedicated by his family. But within the prison system, his death carried far greater consequences. Within a year, at least 31 inmates were killed in retaliatory violence. The war between factions intensified, spreading beyond prison walls and into California's neighborhoods, where it would continue for generations. Among the figures connected to this world was Joseph "Joe" Pegleg Morgan, who rose to become one of La M's most influential leaders. Despite his non-Mexican heritage, he maintained a powerful position within the organization, shaping its internal structure and external operations. Over time, he became both feared and respected, operating as a strategist and enforcer. His reputation grew alongside La M's expansion into street-level drug trafficking and organized crime. Another figure loosely connected to this history was Mike Kudo, a Japanese-American inmate whose background made him highly unusual within the Mexican Mafia ecosystem. Despite ethnic barriers, he earned acceptance through loyalty and participation in violent prison culture. His presence demonstrated that membership within La M was not strictly defined by ethnicity alone, but by actions, trust, and willingness to operate within its rules. Ramon Mundo Mendoza represented another key evolution within the organization. Born in East Los Angeles and initially raised in a religious environment, Mendoza transitioned into gang life and eventually became a feared enforcer within La M. He later committed multiple murders both inside and outside prison before eventually turning informant. His testimony and later writings exposed internal operations of the organization, making him one of the most controversial defectors in its history. Decades later, the legacy of Cadena and the broader La M network resurfaced in a very different context through Hollywood. The film American Me, directed by Edward James Olmos, attempted to portray the origins and evolution of the Mexican Mafia. To ensure authenticity, Olmos consulted former gang members, including individuals who had been directly involved in the organization's history. However, the film's depiction of certain events, particularly the portrayal of violence, betrayal, and sexual assault within prison, sparked outrage among former members and associates. Shortly after the film's release in 1992, violence erupted in Los Angeles. Two individuals associated with the production and consultation of the film were murdered in separate incidents in East Los Angeles neighborhoods. One was shot outside his home. Another was killed in Ramona Gardens. These killings were widely interpreted as retaliation for perceived disrespect toward La M's leadership figures and historical narrative. Joe Morgan, who was still alive at the time, also became directly involved in legal action against the film's producers, alleging defamation and unauthorized use of his life story. He reportedly refused cooperation with the filmmakers and later became associated with efforts to challenge the film's portrayal of his character. Around this period, threats were allegedly directed toward Edward James Olmos, who also reported concerns for his safety and attempted to obtain legal protection. The controversy surrounding American Me highlighted the deep tension between representation and reality. Former members of La M argued that the film distorted key historical figures, particularly Cadena, whose on-screen depiction differed significantly from documented accounts of his death. In reality, Cadena was killed in a prison yard conflict involving rival inmates, not under the circumstances portrayed in the film. For members of the organization, this distinction was not minor. It was a matter of honor, identity, and legacy. Joe Morgan later died in prison in 1993 from liver cancer. His death marked the end of one of La M's most influential early strategists. At the time of his passing, legal disputes connected to the film were still ongoing. Meanwhile, violence connected to its release continued to be reported by various sources, though exact numbers remain disputed. Mundo Mendoza, one of the key informants involved in the film's production, continued speaking publicly about prison culture, gang structure, and the internal logic of La M. His accounts provided insight into the psychological and operational mechanisms of the organization, reinforcing the idea that prison gangs were not simply criminal groups, but highly structured systems of control and retaliation. Over time, the original figures of this history faded into legend, fragmented by competing narratives, media portrayals, and institutional memory.
Cadena became a symbol of early prison power structures. Morgan became a representation of strategic criminal intelligence. Mendoza became a witness to internal truth. And Kudo remained an anomaly within a system defined by strict cultural boundaries. Ultimately, the story of Cheyenne Cadena and Laeme is not simply a history of violence, but a study in institutional evolution. What began as a survival mechanism inside juvenile detention systems transformed into a multi-generational criminal structure that extended far beyond prison walls. And even decades after the deaths of its earliest architects, its influence continued to shape both real-world violence and the way that violence is represented in popular culture. The legacy of American Me, the deaths that followed its release, and the enduring mythology of Laime all point to the same reality. Within this world, stories are never just stories. They are actions, triggers, and consequences. And in that system, even a film can become part of the violence it attempts to depict. If you want more deep dives into hidden worlds like this, subscribe now and don't miss the next story.